Well, what I was asked to speak about is on the theme of embracing diverse spirituality in a changing world. There are lots of ways we could go at this. I want to talk about it really just from the standpoint of religious life, women's religious life, and in a very limited way, actually, but it's mainly from the trajectory of my own life, which one of the fun things about getting to be close to 80 is that you get to look back on life and you can see the development in a way that you can't see it when it's happening. So what I was thinking about was liminality, and that the ways that religious life has been liminal. That is to say, it's been on the edge, it's been on the periphery, being able to look in at least partly from the margins and see what it looks like from there, and see what we look like if we were looked at from the inside out. So I was thinking about when I started in religious life, how liminal we were, or how we were liminal. That is to say, we were very different and distinguished from the rest of the population by our habits that we were. They certainly made us look different from how the rest of the people looked and dressed. By the convent, living in a convent that was very exclusive, and lay people could come in only to certain parts of the convent, and then there was a whole part that was kept aside, was really separate from lay people. And we had our mission to do. We taught, but then after we taught, we went back into the convent, and we could never go into people's houses or except on very rare occasions with permission. So we were very liminal. We were very much on the threshold of the rest of the culture, and very much witnessing to something that was different just by the way we dressed and by the way we lived, as well as presumably by the dedication that prompted all of that, or gave it its motivation. At the time of the Vatican Council, I think maybe it was at least including for Loretto anyway, including the consultation with Thomas Merton, we began to think of liminality in a different way. And we began to think of it as being on the margins, but in the same way as Jesus was on the margins, or led by Jesus to the margins, to be with the poor, to be with people who were oppressed, to make that our identification, which would separate us from the common sort of projects or pursuits of the culture. And so our liminality was cultural in a different way. It was by not going mainstream with the values of the culture, but by standing outside of that, identifying with those who were marginalized by the culture, and working for justice and acting for peace. That became then a certain kind of liminality that we were aiming at, or we wanted to change our lives. And that was behind why we changed from the habit, and why we changed from living in convents to be more with the people, recognizing that we really are the same as everybody else, but we stand in a different posture toward the culture. And so we were really wanting to be, as the church would be, a prophetic challenge to the culture. And as it happened, we began to be a prophetic challenge to the church itself. So what has happened in our current history is that with, I think particularly now, in these last few years, with the attack, if I can call it that, of the apostolic visitation, where we were called to give account of ourselves and never told what the reason was, and incidentally never did see the result of all the apostolic visitations that were done throughout this country. And then the what do they call, Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, or whatever, CDF. I think they call it something else, but the attack on LCWR, we now appear as if we're standing in a liminality vis-a-vis the church in a different way. We're standing really with a kind of dissent from the church itself. And we have found a great deal of solidarity in LCWR with other religious communities, not just in this country, but globally. Throughout the world, religious women are standing together. And so there's a solidarity among religious women that is very strong. And we'll see how it all moves out. We don't know at present how it's going to pan out. But we do know that we're standing now in a different kind of liminality vis-a-vis the church than we were. I remember a retreat that I made way back, and I was so delighted because the priest who was my director at the time said in conclusion that I was a faithful daughter of the church. And it was some years before I began to think about that and think, do I want to be a daughter of the church? If I can't ever be a mother, I'm always going to be a daughter. And that began to seem kind of funny to me. Well, I've moved a lot, and we all have moved to wanting to know our own voice, find our voice, and speak our voice. And it has created, I think, a new level of liminality. So that's the way I've been thinking about, that's the way I began to think about this anyway. How are we liminal? I believe that as I look at the world scene, the church itself is moving or being moved into a liminal place, again, in a quite different way than I believe Jesus intended it to be. I think the church should always be in a liminal place, that is, looking with gospel values at the culture and challenging that. But it seems to me that from another perspective, when we think about the development of human consciousness, and that some scholars anyway are talking about human consciousness as developing from a mythical level, a magical level, to a mythical level, to a rational level, to an integral level, to a mystical level. And that children begin at a level of magic and then move into a mythical level and then become rational as adults. But and that has been happening slowly, those kinds of separations. But the scholars who look at it say that it's happening globally. It's not just one culture or another, though it's happening in each culture with its own time frame. So since the Enlightenment, human consciousness has by and large begun to move more and more strongly into the rational, from the mythic to the rational. Now, what does that mean? I can't go into a big explanation about it, but if you've read Making the Shift, I tried to address that in that little booklet. The mythical means that we read the stories and believe in them or relate to them as historical. And when you move from the mythic to the rational, you understand the stories as stories. They have meaning. You're not rejecting them. You're not dismissing them. You're not poo-pooing them. But you know that you look for their meaning in a different place. It's not just a historical fact, but it's a story that's told with a certain meaning, with a certain intention. And we're seeing, in a way, the collapse of the mythical in favor of the rational, which again doesn't mean that we're getting rid of the scriptures, but we're beginning to recognize that the scriptures were told in a way that fit a mythical mentality. And in this world now, in this culture, with science having developed the way it is developing, we can't any longer stay with our religion in a mythical phase and our reasons moving on in all the rest of our lives. We have to begin to recognize that we are rational and take the mythical with its meanings rather than as its facts. It's an entirely different point of view that we take. And then to move on from the rational to the integral, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the Catholic Church and fundamentalist churches, and the Catholic Church has become more and more fundamentalist church, I believe. The Catholic Church has wanted to stay in the mythic level, and you see that in all the pageantry that has surrounded the conclave and all that, with the medieval costumes that the cardinals are wearing, and the shoes and the hats and all of the sort of rituals that go along with it, and you can see hope in the church now as a new comes into being, that he's moving away from some of those mythical things and saying, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to wear that big hat. I'm going to wear a little hat. Well, that's a step. And so we can see that just, it appeals to us at a certain level. It's very grandiose, and it has absolutely nothing to do with Jesus or the Gospels. And so it's that sort of dichotomy between the Gospels and the way the church functions now as a medieval monarchy or a hierarchy, where the ethic is an ethic of obedience and not an ethic of personal responsibility. And we can see the dichotomy there. And it's why so many Catholics have moved out of the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church has wanted to stay in this mythic context. And so we, as religious women, have moved out. And I don't mean we've not wanted to move out of the Catholic Church. We've wanted to be in the Catholic Church, but we can't do it the way they're asking us to do, or at least for many of us, that has been the case. And so LCWR with leadership has really helped us to move into another frame. And that's where we are then, being isolated by the Vatican and told we cannot do these things. And that's where we are right now. That may not last too much longer. It may come to some kind of a resolution quickly or not. To look at that trajectory just quickly from another standpoint, if you look at the development of human history, you can see a very early development of what would have been families, and then tribes, and different tribes differentiating, and then coming together, maybe tribes coming together into what was a city-state, and then into a nation. And then when nations come together, we imagine the UN, which is dysfunctional now because it's constructed under an empire kind of image. And so and then we've moved from the UN now to begin to think of ourselves as global and as planetary, and the planet as such a tiny part of a whole cosmic process, so that the frame has continually widened and widened and widened. And as that happens, and our individual rational frames begin to widen and widen and widen, we need to move into the integral phase of consciousness, which would mean that we want to include, we want to see how things fit together, we want to help them fit together. We want not to keep separate, because there's no future for any human being in being separate, or any group of humans. We've got to find ways of linking and collaborating. And we know that our future, if there is to be one, lies in that direction. We're just beginning to understand that. So when they look at the development of consciousness, they see it as moving to include and transcend. In other words, as you include, as you begin to establish more relationships and a wider frame, you begin to transcend the frame that you lived in before. And so we can think of that in our Catholicism, that we started with I started this in my history with a very ghettoized Catholicism. When I grew up, we couldn't go into a Protestant church without committing a mortal sin. And it was, you really had to be afraid of the larger culture. You had to go to a Catholic school. Your parents were told, under pain of sin, they had to put their children in a Catholic school if they possibly could. And when it came to college, you better not go to a secular university, because you would lose your faith if you did. And so that it was being afraid, really, of conversation or of losing something if you if you got in the company of a person of another persuasion. And that really did apply. I had in my youth very little contact with anyone. I had one Protestant. I knew one Protestant, I think, a girl, but I knew no Protestant kids. And my family, really, we related all to Catholics. My father had a few Jewish friends, I think, that he worked with, but very little contact. And there was a real danger. I mean, we attached real danger to association with others. And, and if you did, lose your faith, you were going to go to hell. And so the stakes were really high. That's a mythic frame that we were living in. And we believed, and some Catholics do still believe, that we Catholics have the repository of all the truth. And you have to be, if you're going to be saved, you have to become Catholic and do it our way. And so there's that very small bringing together. Well, into the 19th century, then ecumenism began to develop, and that was a whole new thing. It developed first among the Protestants as wanting to advance their mission. They realized that they could do mission better if they were talking to each other and collaborating, working together. Catholics came to it in the 20th century, really with Vatican II, a little preceding Vatican II and into Vatican II, that we began to want to recognize the Protestants as our brothers and sisters. Now, they were not fully in the church, but they were at least brothers and sisters, and even changing that language changed the way we were able to view them. If we were brothers and sisters, we had some things in common, and we belonged to the same family, and we would have to sort of open our hearts to find out, well, who were they, and so on. So that gave a whole new spirit. And notice then that tribes are coming together. I mean, that there's a unification going on that's little by little happening. starting under the surface and little by little moving up to the surface and becoming more the way we thought and the way we did things. Well, of course, it was self-serving for Christianity to come together in that way. But when you look at it, you can see movement. You can see evolution happening, both in our consciousness and in our social organization, in our cultures. You can see that there's something pushing toward unification. Now, what is the push? I don't know. I like to think of it as the Holy Spirit, who from the beginning has been about bringing people together in love. And that is the work of the Holy Spirit in the whole of creation, bringing things into unity. That's the way I like to think about it. Well, I want to talk just briefly about my own personal history in this particular context. I grew up as a ghettoized Catholic, and I went to graduate school just at the time of Vatican II, which was wonderful because I got in on the opening of the windows, and so that graduate school changed me a great deal. As I came into real midlife, I had this longing in me to know God, which I've always had and have to this day. And I realized that I still didn't know how to pray, and I wanted to do that. And so I had one summer, I went to a Hindu ashram in Vermont and spent, I don't know, maybe 6 weeks there, and just lived in that Hindu environment. And then I had a sabbatical coming, and from my teaching in the college, and I chose to do the sabbatical to study Zen. And I used the first semester to go to California, where Zen was located. I did the first part in another Hindu ashram of women, which was a wonderful experience. And then I went to Japan, and then I went to a Zen center in California till Christmas. And then after Christmas, I went to Japan and was in a Zen monastery in Japan for the next 5 months. But there are lots of stories, and I can't tell them, but I want to tell a story that changed me. And it was when I was in the Hindu ashram, and it was a very small group of women, and I think the oldest was 32. And they were wanting to be nuns, and they welcomed me because they thought, you know how to do it, and you can teach us. And well, I was not prepared for that, but they let me live with them and just do everything they did the way they did it. And one evening, they had what they call a puja, which is a religious ritual. And they had prepared for weeks for it, and they allowed me to participate in it. So I remember sitting in that little room, and they had a statue, a fairly large statue, about maybe 1.5 yards, maybe 2 yards. And as I remember it, it was a statue of a male. And it had a god's name. I don't know. I don't remember that. But the god had been traveling and had come to visit them. And they were wanting to welcome and entertain God. And so they had dressed an altar, and with very beautiful, covered it with flowers and petals of flowers, and they washed his feet of the statue, and they offered him food and incense, and all the while chanting. It was very, very deeply spiritual and very beautiful. And I sat there with them in that puja, and my heart knew that we were worshiping the same God. And I was aware of two things. One, that they had taken me in the way they took this God in. And the second one was that if I were viewed by my co-religionists at the time, they would have said, this is sinful and you are worshiping an idol. And I knew in my heart that the God I was worshiping was not that statue, but something deeper than that the statue represented for them. And that same God was the God that I thought, that I sought. So that then began put things in a different perspective for me, and that introduces then a movement not toward just Christian ecumenicity, but toward how do we relate to all the religious traditions of the world, the Hindus, the Buddhists, the Jewish people, the Muslims, the Baha'is, the indigenous traditions. And I kept that kind of quest, I guess, in my heart for how do we come into unity? How do we realize the unity that really is at the base of all of our religions? And after I came back, after I came back from Japan my sabbatical year, I taught for a couple of years, and then I knew I wasn't going to teach anymore, and I then went and spent a couple of years with the Quakers, 2 years at Pendle Hill with the Quakers. And at Pendle Hill, I became acquainted with what they called Catholics, and that was Quaker Catholics. And they were people who loved Quaker silence and Quaker way of consensus decision-making and Quaker meetings and so on, and the egalitarianism of the Quakers, and loved also Catholic ritual and Catholic, felt themselves to be Catholic and Jesus and all. Well, Quakers are Christian too, of course. But so that then shortly, well, no, a while after that, I heard a rabbi speak who said, before very long, everyone in this culture and maybe around the world is going to be hyphenated. And by that he meant that we would have a foot in more than one camp. And very recently I was talking to a woman who said, just kind of casually, as I was introduced to her, she said, my husband and I are Episcopalian Buddhists, and we've just come from a Buddhist retreat in Massachusetts. And I thought right away of that rabbi and the hyphenation. And more, I know people who are more than one denomination, who love parts of more than one denomination or even more than one tradition. So there are Hindu Methodists or Episcopalian Buddhists. Obviously, we all, what I've come to think is we all have some of that in us now, whether we know it or not, and whether we like it or not. And how are we going to relate to that? People who are Islamic Christians, it's like we can see beauty and we can see truth in more than one camp. So why do we need to have those camps so rigidly distanced from each other? So it's not now just Christian ecumenism that's in question. It's East and West. They have met and they are talking together. It happened maybe in the 70s with the East. I remember in Denver the Hare Krishnas on the corners, and the gurus and the roshis, and some of us didn't even know what those words meant. But can we recognize the touchstone of the Holy Spirit there, working to bring things together, working from under the surface, and then requiring that we deal rationally with the differences and say, what do we need to do to be together in love? How can we be bound in love even if we have differences in the way we say things or the words we use to describe them? And what could be the role of religious women in that kind of an ecumenism, that kind of a unifying, bringing together? We have been influenced. That it's a done deed. We have changed. Just think of the regard in which people across the world hold the Dalai Lama, and some hold the word of the Pope as well. I mean, think of the publicity the Pope got all around the world. Think of Thich Nhat Hanh and the influence that he's had on many of us, reading about nonviolence. Think of nonviolence coming from Gandhi and now beginning to take root where Christians could find it in their roots, and presumably others can find it in their traditions as well. Think of Thich Nhat Hanh and walking meditation, or mindfulness, how we hear that from the Buddhists, and how we can connect it with what we were trying to learn as Catholic sisters, as recollection. But we came at it differently. But we've learned a lot from the way Buddhists do mindfulness. Or think of mantras, using mantras, and how that word came into us by way of an Indian, I think mostly DeMello, talking about mantras, or the guy in Canada, whose name escapes me right now, you know what I mean, starting with the Jesus prayer and connecting that with mantras. You know that when TM, Transcendental Meditation, came in, and metta meditation, and the word karma and sanghas, those words have become in our vocabulary. So we talk about good karma and bad, my bad karma, you know, whatever. And how those Eastern traditions have influenced our Western Christianity in environmentalism and in recognizing the interconnectedness of everything, have helped us to see that with a different philosophical stance, and to change our minds and open our hearts. Think of the influence of indigenous peoples, of the Mayans, of the American native peoples, and how some of their rituals even have penetrated some of our rituals, and how we have learned to appreciate their way of reverencing the earth and the Great Spirit, and so on. So can we find the unifying factors at the deepest level of our own religious tradition? And how can we be intentional about that? And how can we participate in what I believe is the movement of the Holy Spirit in bringing us all together? A big question for us Catholics, I think, is what are we afraid of? You know, we've lived so long with sanctions, with our ways of saying our dogma having sanctioned ways. You can say it this way, but you can believe this, but you can't say those words. You have to say it this way. We think of, I remember when Cardinal Ratzinger pronounced Eastern meditation taboo for Catholics, and more recently, retreat centers being closed because they're doing Reiki, and Reiki is supposed to be just a superstition, which is dangerous for us. So that or the bishop in, I don't know, Michigan, I think, Wisconsin, who claimed that centering prayer was dangerous and you needed to have a special charism to do centering prayer. So in so many ways, the Roman Catholic Church has and is continuing to close its doors rather than to keep its windows open. And we're, in some ways, I think, afraid of being liminal, of standing on the margin and saying, we want to pull this, we want to take steps that may look like they're separating us, but really what we're wanting to do is to bring into being a new kind of unity. Are we afraid to talk with each other, we religious women, about what we used to believe and no longer believe? Are we afraid to say it? Are we afraid that we'll damage somebody else's faith if we say, I don't believe that anymore? Or here's how I believe that now. And we may believe it differently than we did. And we may still reverence it, but not believe it anymore. We may reverence other person's right to believe it and know that it's good for others, but no longer functional for me. We're committed to seeking God, and we know that God can't be contained in any language or any dogma or any kind of composition. We know that our gospel thirst for justice and peace is the work of God, in the work of the Holy Spirit in our world. And so when we work for justice and peace, that too is religion wanting to bring people together into a new kind of communion where there's enough for everyone, where people can live in peace with one another because they don't need to fight for territory or try to be empires that take over everybody, but simply dwell in peace with each other, hospitably, and learn from each other, welcoming each other. Our hearts and minds know that God can't be contained or defined, can only be sought, and sought with an open heart and an open mind. Insofar as our church calls itself Catholic, if we think of Catholic as bringing everybody into thinking the way we think, and everybody has to do it our way, then by definition we are falsifying what the word Catholic means. I think we all know that being Catholic means universal, and to be universal means to have an open mind, to see truth where truth is, and where one's heart and one's mind recognize truth and are open to it. Catholicism can't claim that it is the only institution that is Catholic. It has to be a continual process of inclusion rather than exclusion. Inclusion and transcending, something new coming to be from the inclusion. We see things differently. We get different ways of naming things, and it comes together differently. We see a different unity and some different motivations that push us to come together. Catholicism suggests boundarylessness rather than boundaries, I believe. So my question for us is, how do we need to think, we as religious women, how can we be committed to seeking God and the reign of God in this world? Be consciously participating in this process of inclusion and transcending, of speaking to and speaking with and learning from, always learning from differences and taking them in. Are we willing to risk change even in our faith and the way we hold our faith? And if we do that, what will hold us together? Can we stay together in the search, in the journey? Are we shy of talking about that, of talking about what practices now are meaningful for us that maybe were not, and what practices used to be meaningful for us and are no longer, and how we've been changed? Can we talk particularly about how we've been changed by encounters and by having our perspective widened by encounters with others? And what is making us afraid to do that? Or when will we find our voices to do that? We are in process now, religious women, of choosing our posture toward our Catholic Church, and in process of choosing our posture toward the evolution of humanity and how we're going to participate in both of those. So it will cause chaos in us internally, and is causing chaos among us as groups and as church. But are we going to hunker down and hang on, or are we going to open up? That's a question that faces us. Now, I'm not saying, and I want to be clear about that, that everybody needs to go out and learn how to do Buddhist meditation, or everybody has to go out and look for change or try to change their faith or whatever. Each of us is on our own path. Each of us needs to follow the inner voice that tells us, move here, move on. This is where you belong. This is where your gift will find its usefulness. It's where your gift will fit and harmonize with the others. Each of us has to pay that kind of close attention, and we need to support each other in doing it. If we straddle, we know that we're going to lose our balance a little bit, and we're going to have to struggle to find what the balance is, and where will we be led to sort of put our weight, or how will we find our balance in that? Are we going to be on ice and risking maybe the ice isn't going to be thick enough to hold us? Are we going to stay on solid ground because it's safer? What's going to be our attitude here? How can we participate? That's the question. With integrity, with the integrity that is the work of the Holy Spirit within us. There is no right place to be. There's only the place that's right for me and for you, for each of us, and then for us to support each other standing where we are, with the integrity, and to support each other's communities standing where they are with what's right for them. All communities won't do the same thing, but knowing that the bottom line is always love, is always forgiving, is always reconciling, is always wanting to do it peacefully, non-violently, bring it together, that and the thirst that the gospel gives us for peace and for justice in the world, with love as the unifying factor. That's where we want to participate. And how are we going to do it?